Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to ICAS proceedings. We have a great speaker tonight, Ned Price, who used to be a mouthpiece for the State Department. David Lee, are you out there? Please introduce Ned Price. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Today I have the honor of introducing our distinguished speaker. Ned Price most recently served as the Deputy to the U.S. Representative to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, overseeing the U.S. mission to the United Nations Washington office, and as a Deputy Cabinet level official, serving as a standing member of the National Security Council's Deputies Committee. In 2021, he assumed the role of department spokesperson at the Department of State until March 2023. He then served as Senior Advisor to Secretary of State Anthony J. Blinken until taking a leadership role with the U.S. mission to the UN. Ned was co-founder and Director of Policy and Communications at National Security Action. He served as Special Assistant to President Obama on the National Security Council staff, where Ned also was a spokesperson and Senior Director for Strategic Communications. He previously was at the Central Intelligence Agency, where he was a Senior Analyst and Spokesperson. Ned has been on an NBC News analyst and contributor and taught at Georgetown University and George Washington University. He graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and received a master's from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Ned Price has been recently named an ICAS Fellow in honor of his dedicated service at the State Department. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ned Price.
David, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Let me also thank Dr. Kim for the invitation to address you today, and more so for the invitation to become a fellow with this institution. I'm really grateful for that and look forward to collaboration going forward over the coming months and years. As Dr. Kim alluded to, there's a lot to talk about today, and I really do want to make this as interactive as possible and as useful as possible to all of you. Before we turn it open to questions and conversation, I thought I would do a few things. First, I'll offer an overview of what we did and sought to do during the Biden administration, how we went about doing it. I'll speak to what we accomplished and the business that remains unfinished. And then I'll spend just a minute contrasting that approach to the approach of the current administration, the Trump administration. Of course, I don't work for the Trump administration. I'm not speaking on behalf of them. All of you, I'm sure, will have your own opinions of this current administration, but I will at least offer my own impressions. And from there, I look forward to taking your questions, and hopefully we can engage in a dialogue with the time we have left. So if that sounds okay, let me first start with a few words about the approach of the Biden administration during our 4 years in office. When we came into office in January of 2021, we recognized going into that period that we were at what we called an inflection point. It was one of those rare moments in time when the international system didn't have the capability merely to evolve, but it had the capability of transforming. It was a time when, as we recognized, the choices we were going to make in government would shape the landscape, not for months or even years, but for decades and potentially generations to come. And now we came into office with a pretty clear-eyed view of that. We understood that the world wasn't going merely through a change. It was entering, and we were entering, a new era. To put a very a finer point on this, as we put it at the time, the post-Cold War era, that is to say the era from the end of the Cold War until 9/11 or so, and then the era that followed that had very plainly run its course. Secretary Blinken often said that the post-Cold War era was over, and we were in the midst of a race to define what came next and what would come next. Now, when you think about that former era, the era that has now been decidedly closed, it had been defined largely by an assumption, I think too often taken for granted in DC, that open markets, open societies, American-led globalization, these systems were not just ascendant, but they were inevitable. It was, as some put it, or had been, as some put it, the end of history. Now, of course, there were real achievements during that period, to be sure. There were historic gains in poverty reduction. There were fewer wars between states. There was unprecedented cooperation on some of the transnational issues that we faced at the time and still continue to face. But beneath the surface, the portrait we tried to paint was one of a very shifting picture. China, during this period, had become much more assertive, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also on the global stage. It was projecting economic, military, and political influence in ways that I think notably challenged the foundational rules of the road. That is to say, the rules of the road that had been established in the wake of World War II to prevent another cataclysmic war between states. Russia, for its part, under Putin, had grown more repressive at home, as we saw it, and more aggressive beyond its borders. And of course, that was punctuated not only in 2014 by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also in 2022 by its reinvasion, its full-scale invasion of Ukraine that started in February 2022. Autocrats, whether these two or other autocrats around the world, they were exporting digital tools of repression and disinformation. Multilateral institutions were under strain. In some cases, they were unable to adequately respond to many of the crises we were facing, whether it was humanitarian, whether it was health, whether it was some of the transnational challenges that we faced. It is true that economic globalization had delivered immense wealth, but the fact is that wealth had not been distributed equitably. We also faced a set of global challenges that we recognized at the time no country could tackle alone. I mentioned a moment ago, there was a pandemic that exposed global health vulnerabilities, climate change that was accelerating in many ways faster than even some of the worst projections. There were fragile states, failed states. There was food insecurity that was a result of compounding result of so many of these crises. Also, something deeper in a way happened. There was a breakdown in trust. There was a breakdown in trust among governments, between governments and citizens, and between people and institutions of every kind. This isn't something that happened overnight. Obviously, it was accelerated by the forces of COVID, by economic globalization. But it was very clear that the trust that had been at the core of so many of these systems was frayed, if not fully eroded. So with that context, it was very clear to us that we were living through a transition from one era to the next. And the real question, I think the urgent question that we faced and that we tried to answer was what comes next? Would the world drift towards disorder, or could we help shape a more stable, more inclusive, more resilient international system? Now, I should say that in January of 2021, when we came into office, we didn't look to fully restore that old order. We recognized at the time there were so many disruptors, some of which I've already mentioned, that old order wasn't coming back. And frankly, as I also alluded to, some of its underlying assumptions deserve to be fully revisited, if not redrafted entirely. So we believe that the U.S. should lead in shaping a new era by standing up for universal principles, by investing in our core strengths, and by rallying partners around the world to meet what we recognized as shared challenges. I remember often traveling with Secretary Blinken. He would say very clearly, if the United States wasn't leading, one of two things would happen, and neither of them would be good. Either someone else would fill the vacuum, and probably in a way that wouldn't be reflective of America's values and interests, and those values and interests that we share with allies and partners around the table, or perhaps worse yet, no one would, and it would be a power vacuum. There would be the law of the jungle. We've lived through eras of both, and neither produced dividends that were that were useful. Our goal in all of this wasn't dominance. It was a global system where countries, large and small, could make their own choices, where sovereignty was respected, where aggression didn't pay, and where cooperation was possible, even despite some of the profound differences that divided us from many of our counterparts around the globe. And animating this vision were really four pillars. Number one, we were investing in our strength and resilience at home. Number two, we were rebuilding and modernizing our alliances, including and especially in the Indo-Pacific. Number three, we were partnering with allies and partners around the world to tackle global challenges. And number four, we were seeking to adapt the international system to meet the realities of this profoundly new and different era. So just a word on how we went about this. First, we knew that American leadership would be credible only if it was anchored in what we called domestic renewal. That's why we made historic investments at home here in the United States in infrastructure and clean energy and technology. We brought home supply chains. We invested in workers. We bolstered our own democratic resilience. This wasn't just sound economic policy. To our mind, it was foundational to our global competitiveness. There's a nexus between domestic policy and foreign policy. We tend to think of these in silos, but over the course of years, this was true in the Obama administration, became more pronounced during the first Trump administration, and certainly during the Biden administration. Domestic policy was foreign policy and vice versa. I remember pretty distinctly the first time we met with a senior delegation from the PRC. Many of you probably remember this as well. It was March of 2021. We were still in the midst of COVID. Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan, we met with our counterparts for the first time in Anchorage. I think that meeting is most remembered for, I would say, the lively remarks that preceded it from the Chinese delegation and the response from the American delegation. But has stuck out to me in the intervening years was how we started the meeting once the press spray was over. We didn't start by talking about the thorny issues that divided us, whether it's Taiwan or human rights. We didn't start talking about the issues on which we had to cooperate, whether that was climate change or synthetic opioids. We started the meeting, the U.S. side started the meeting by talking about our domestic economic agenda. And some might rightly ask why, but we wanted very clearly to demonstrate to the PRC that the idea they were trying to sell at the time of a declining, diminishing power racked by COVID wasn't at all accurate. We wanted to leave them privately with the actually accurate impression that we had a plan to get our economy back on track, to get our domestic house in order, and a domestic agenda to revitalize what we saw as the engine of American power, both at home and around the world. Second, when it comes to all this, we recognized very early on, and this was really foundational to President Biden's belief as a longtime public servant, that our alliances weren't just a strategic asset. We actually believe they were and are a force multiplier. And so we were focused on updating them, making them fit for purpose for this new era. For example, NATO, far from being obsolete, as some had previously suggested, became larger, more united, in some ways more purposeful than ever. And of course, that was in large part because of the shared threat of Russian aggression, but it was also a byproduct of American investment in NATO, American confidence in NATO. In the Indo-Pacific, we stepped up our diplomatic game. We invested in our alliances with Japan and Korea, relationships built on decades of trust, but clearly relationships also in need of modernization for these 21st century challenges. And here, the story is important. When we first came into office, our two closest allies in Northeast Asia, Japan and South Korea, were barely on speaking terms. All of you know this history quite well. Historical grievances and political friction had really left a vacuum that our competitors, in some cases adversaries, were eager to exploit. Of course, we focused on the bilateral relationship, but with both countries, but we also believe that trilateral cooperation among the United States, Japan, and Korea wasn't just a good thing, it was essential, it was imperative, it was indispensable. So we work quietly, we work consistently, behind the scenes and later publicly to buttress this trilateral relationship. We supported our allies in bridging their differences. And once they did, we wanted to make sure we leveraged the moment to institutionalize that progress. All of you, I'm sure, remember quite well the Trilateral Summit in August of 2023. It was, I think, importantly, not just a diplomatic photo op. It was in many ways a strategic breakthrough. It was the byproduct of decades of investment of successive American administrations, and yes, decades of work on the part of the ROK and Japan, establishing real mechanisms for joint military planning, for intelligence sharing, for economic coordination, among other elements. It sent what I think was a pretty powerful signal, whether to Pyongyang, to Beijing, and to capitals around the world, that democracies could overcome the weight of history to forge a common future. And that trilateral relationship really became a model, as we saw it, for how sustained, concerted diplomacy could produce results, how it could deliver, how as democracies we could work to deliver for our own peoples. But of course, our Indo-Pacific strategy didn't end there. We built out the Quad alongside our counterparts in India, Japan, and Australia, not just as a military bloc, and of course it is not primarily a military bloc, but as a platform for cooperations on key issues like vaccines, tech standards, infrastructure, maritime security, among other realms and issues. The leaders of the Quad convened for the first time. They met multiple times, including for the last time during the Biden administration at the president's home in Wilmington, Delaware. As you all know, we launched AUKUS, deepening defense cooperation between Australia, the United States, United Kingdom. We elevated partnerships with the Philippines, with Vietnam. We launched a new economic framework like IPEF to help write 21st century rules for trade, for clean energy, for digital governance. We also, in all of this, and I think this was especially important, made clear to our partners in the Indo-Pacific and even beyond that we weren't asking countries to choose between Washington and Beijing. What we wanted to offer to our partners in the region and well beyond was a choice. Open access to markets, transparent development financing, a rules-based order, and sovereignty free from coercion. And, I think one of the most important things we did with all of this as the backdrop was to, as we said at the time, to stitch together our alliances between the Atlantic and Pacific. We weren't content to having these strengthened but disparate networks in different theaters. We wanted to bring them together. So we brought our key partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific closer to NATO. We brought our NATO allies closer to the Indo-Pacific. We launched AUKUS, as I said before, and we worked in other ad hoc ways to make clear that our interests as a Pacific country, but also a country with deep roots across the Atlantic, that those interests were common, whether it was in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, or in those theaters. And we wanted to bring our partners together to work on common challenges. When it comes to those common challenges, and this is the third point, we wanted to be sure to tackle them with these new coalitions and that creative diplomacy. So if you take Ukraine as an example, we supported Ukraine, of course, not only with arms and humanitarian assistance and economic assistance, but perhaps most importantly, with an unprecedented coalition of more than 50 countries that offer Ukraine some of the same forms of assistance. That collective response was, I think, critical to helping Ukraine withstand the first blows of Russia's brutal invasion, and has helped Ukraine to stand firm since. We led efforts to address food security, to respond to pandemics, to tackle synthetic drug trafficking. Secretary Blinken always used to like to call this strategy variable geometry. And by that, he meant that our approach was to recognize a problem and from there to work backwards, to identify the partners we need, to identify the ad hoc coalitions that we need. Sometimes those solutions would include our traditional alliances like NATO, our traditional allies in the Indo-Pacific, but oftentimes these were ad hoc coalitions that were created to take on a particular challenge. So yes, we brought together allies and partners, but we also brought together the private sector. civil society, international institutions, recognizing that modern diplomacy can't only be an exercise between and among states. We made sure to bring other voices to the table, whether that's civil society, young people, women, the private sector, because we also recognize that diplomacy can't afford to be confined to closed rooms, to closed door rooms and closed door meetings among merely government officials. Fourth and finally, in this case, we sought to reform and to revitalize this very international system. Much of this will be well known to you as you think back on the earliest days of the Biden administration. We rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement. We restored funding to the World Health Organization. We led efforts to reshape development finance. We sought to really moved the ball forward when it came to UN Security Council reform. We sought to give the Global South a greater and more meaningful voice in issues of global governance and meaningful participation in institutions of global governance. We also championed efforts to connect countries, including in many cases countries and partners in the Global South, with high standard infrastructure financing through something that primarily we call the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investments, which mobilized hundreds of billions of dollars for clean, for transparent, sustainable development. I remember early in the Biden administration, we would travel around the world, especially to the Global South, and we'd hear from some of our partners in places like Africa and the Pacific Islands and Latin America and elsewhere, that they didn't necessarily want investment on the part of those who had this very extractive model, a model that paid no regard to the environment, to labor rights, to human rights, and a model that too often left these countries mired in debt. And so we took it on to launch this initiative with our G7 partners, ultimately mobilizing hundreds of billions of dollars in capital collectively, and also leveraging the power of the American private sector. In all of this, I think it's critical to emphasize that we treated our values and the values that unite the United States with allies and partners around the world, not as an afterthought, but really as a strategic glue, a strategic asset. We stood up for human rights and democratic principles, not just out of longstanding or perceived moral obligation, but because we understood that forces like repression, corruption, authoritarianism, they often went hand in hand with instability and conflict. It was not just a nice to have. In our minds, it was an indispensable element of our approach to the world beyond our shores. Now, throughout all of this, we were also very clear-eyed about the fact that we weren't alone on the world stage. Russia, China, others had their own vision for what a post-American world might look like. They were very eager to bring on this post-American vision. But that vision, insofar as we saw it, was built on coercion. It was built on aggression, on debt traps, a rejection of the international rules that have, despite their manifest imperfections, helped preserve peace and prosperity for decades. And so, as I said, we offered a different model, a model that prioritized cooperation, transparency, agency for partners and allies around the world, recognizing that we didn't have all the answers. But precisely because we still believe that in an open and connected world, democratic values are a strategic asset. They are not a liability. In many ways, there are comparative advantage. And we govern with the conviction that American power matters most, and it is most effective when it's exercised alongside others, not above them. It is not something that's done to them, but it is something that is wielded with them in coordination and cooperation with partners and allies. My own view is that the Indo-Pacific served as a proving ground for this approach. It helped us to demonstrate how diplomacy, defense, development, how the integration of those elements could be aligned across multiple domains, how it could help fellow democracies deliver for their people, for our collective peoples. That's what we sought to do as an administration. Now, as I close this out, I won't claim that everything we did was perfect. Diplomacy is messy. Progress can be uneven. Progress is not necessarily irreversible. But I believe, and I'm confident in saying, that we showed what principled American leadership could look like: steady, strategic, inclusive, and effective. Before I turn to questions and have a dialogue, I do want to spend just a moment on what we've seen over the past 6 or so months of the current Trump administration. And I think it goes without saying that this is in many ways in stark contrast to the Biden administration's approach. President Trump's approach, I think both, it is fair to say, during the 4 years he had in his first term, the first 6 months or so of the second iteration, it's been marked by, again, what I would characterize as volatility, by personalization of the office. I think a near total absence of process. And I say that as someone who spent several years on the National Security Council staff, who's worked at departments and agencies and knows just how crucial that process is. Now, some people have called this a realist approach, but there may be better ways to describe it. Mercantilist may be a more accurate description. And I say that on the day when tariffs are kicking in across the world, where countries are paying 10% or in some cases much higher. Now, I think during the first term of President Trump, we saw foreign policy decisions were made not through interagency deliberation or in many cases strategic planning, but in many cases, too many cases, through improvisation, often announced via social media with little warning to allies or even senior U.S. officials. This pattern, I think, has continued during the second term, and it's in many ways has only intensified. And in this term, what gives me a great amount of concern is that those with experience and judgment, in some cases, we saw them around the table in the first term, but they aren't there. They are not at the table, especially in the national security realm, in President Trump's second term. I think another commonality with the first term, there remains a centralization of power around the president himself. Oftentimes, we've seen decisions that are driven by grievance, by instinct, by personal affinity for an individual or a group, or by domestic politics here in the United States, rather than national interest or strategic logic. Our long-standing alliances and partnerships in some cases continue to be treated less as force multipliers than as financial transactions, financial burdens. I think the current administration often sees these as zero-sum relationships predicated on whether someone is paying enough, whether in terms of funding or praise for the administration and President Trump himself. I think Jake Sullivan, the former national security advisor, put it well in one of his first set of remarks upon leaving office. He made the point that this is not just a matter of policy difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. We could have guessed that there would be profound policy differences between our two teams. I think what gives so many of us such great concern is that President Trump and his administration have seemed to have gone about systematically undermining some of the core American advantages in the world, systematically dismantling them. I've mentioned our allies and partners. They've trashed many of them. They've undermined key relationships in key places. They've injected unpredictability into our economy, into our investment environment, both in those economic partnerships around the world and the attractiveness of the U.S. market domestically. They've ended so many of our soft power elements, from USAID to the U.S. Agency for Global Media and its component elements, to English language programs, to the student visa program. In doing so, they've eroded the idea that the U.S. can attract the best talent from around the world. They've made it much more difficult and forced some of the finest students around the world to think once or to reconsider when thinking about pursuing an education at America's finest universities. This isn't just symbolic erosion of norms, of policies, of practices. I think what's so concerning is that it provides a signal to America's adversaries that we are a country in retreat, if not decline. It is precisely the opposite message that we attempted to portray to our Chinese counterparts in March of 2021 in Anchorage. That uncertainty, that signal that I fear this administration is sending, it is making deterrence more difficult. It is perhaps in some ways making conflict more likely. Meanwhile, the deference to authoritarian leaders is persisting. The message to autocrats has been very clear. Democratic backsliding, human rights abuses, issues of values, normative considerations, these won't factor meaningfully into Washington's decision-making and calculus. And I think that really eats at the core of the relationship we have with our allies, that relationships that are predicated, yes, on interests, but also longstanding values. And that's very much the case with Japan and the ROK. All the while, we have moved further away from key international agreements, not only once again abandoning efforts to re-engage on climate issues like non-proliferation, but pulling back from the very institutions designed to coordinate on these global challenges. The result, I think, is that America finds itself increasingly isolated, just as the problems we face have become more complex and in some ways more intertwined. In the Indo-Pacific, I think this confusion has been particularly acute. The first Trump term oscillated in some ways between confrontation and neglect. In the second Trump term, I think we're witnessing a similar pattern. Tariffs are revived, alliances are being strained. Our key allies like South Korea and Japan have been at least given scant high-level attention. The hard-won progress on the trilateral relationship that I spoke to earlier between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo, an achievement that took years, if not decades, of patient diplomacy, is now at risk of fraying under a return to the sort of transactional rhetoric of this administration. And all of this unfolds amidst a broader sense of instability. Some of our allies are hedging, some of our competitors are probing or seeking to leverage to take advantage of the current moment. And the credibility of U.S. commitments built over the course of generation is being called into question. And in some cases, you can't question those who are doing so. What worries me most in some ways is that the question, and I'll take this back to where I started, that we face at the outset of the Biden administration, what comes after this post-Cold War era, remains unanswered. The Biden administration started to set out an answer to that and to work in tandem with allies and partners to start out and to embark on that new chapter. But this question remains very live, and the Trump administration is offering an acutely different response. My fear is that their actions now could have implications for years, if not longer, to come as that inflection point remains. How the Trump administration responds to this inflection point, I think, will be a legacy that will define the United States for years, if not quite a bit longer. So why don't I leave it there? I very much look forward to questions and conversation and to hearing from all of you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ned. That's a great presentation. Just setting up for the next hot air discussion, Q&A. Before we get into the Q&A, I want to make a short remark on ICAS. ICAS is not an agent of any government or foreign principal. There's no foreign funds involved in ICAS activities. That said, who's going to go first shot? Anybody raise your hand? Okay, Mike Frenchek, are you ready? Mike.
I got myself on here.
Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Thank you for the presentation. One of the things that you mentioned was the Quad relationship, also in the time frame AUKUS came about. What is going to be the impact as those continue to develop in the future to the relationship between the U.S., the Republic of Korea, and Japan? And the follow-on question I have also that I have questions about is how will our actions in the Ukraine affect how the Republic of Korea and other allies and adversaries in the Indo-Pacific view the U.S. and our resilience in alliances that we have formed?
Yeah, both very good questions. I'll start with the second first. When it comes to Ukraine and the implications for the approach the United States led to helping Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression. Clearly, the American response and the global response to what happened in February of 2022 and thereafter was watched very closely in Moscow and other capitals in Europe, but perhaps no capital watched this more closely than Beijing. I think the concerted and coordinated way in which the United States led a coalition of dozens of countries, 50 plus countries have provided security assistance, dozens of countries have provided economic and humanitarian assistance. I think that sent, obviously, a boost of support to Ukraine. It was a very powerful message to Vladimir Putin, but I think it was also a warning to President Xi that if he harbors ambitions to change the status quo across the Taiwan Straits with force, that there will be consequences, and that the United States has the diplomatic heft, the diplomatic wherewithal to lead a multilateral response to a unilateral effort to change the status quo. That was clearly what we did in the case of President Putin's aggression. And I think the message was unmistakable to Beijing that many of these same allies would find an effort to unilaterally change the status quo across the strait as unacceptable. And so I think, if anything, and I think it is fair to say that our response in Ukraine has only cemented our commitment to our treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific. It gave them a real test case for and with a country with whom we don't actually have a security commitment. Of course, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. There are no binding security assurances that the United States had with Ukraine at the time, and yet we recognized the corrosive implications of this aggression if left unchecked. And so I think that also sent a very reassuring message, or it should have sent a very reassuring message to many of our treaty allies, yes, in Europe with NATO, but also to our treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific, of course, the ROK and Japan chief among them. When it comes to the groupings in the Indo-Pacific that the United States sought to either create or to revitalize under the Biden administration, look, I think the future under this administration is somewhat uncertain. There was some degree of uncertainty regarding AUKUS. It's been widely reported that a senior defense official in President Trump's administration has called into question the AUKUS alliance and whether certain elements of that, namely the nuclear-powered submarine elements, should go forward. It sounds like the partnership remains on steadier ground now, but of course, all of this is subject to change under an administration that sometimes can veer from left to right. And the Quad too. I think many of us were heartened when Secretary Rubio, in one of his earliest meetings within hours of taking office, had a meeting with his Quad counterparts. I think successive American administrations have recognized the importance of the Quad. It was an organization that started under George W. Bush, after all, but it was really hypercharged under President Biden, meeting at the leaders level for the first time. I should say, in all of this, however, that just because the ROK isn't a member of one or more of these organizations, it doesn't, the intent is not and was not to send a signal that these groupings are exclusive or exclusionary. This is part and parcel of the strategy that I spoke to just a few minutes ago of assembling ad hoc coalitions that are fit for purpose. There will be some groupings to which the ROK or Japan will belong, to which other countries that are a member of AUKUS or the Quad won't. It's a concerted effort, or it was a concerted effort as part of this variable geometry to bring together those countries who are most affected by the transnational challenges, by a transnational challenge or a set of transnational challenges, and who could contribute towards the defense against those challenges in a specific circumstance. And so obviously we did quite a bit of work trilaterally with Japan and the ROK. We did a tremendous amount of work bilaterally with Japan and the ROK, brought the ROK closer to NATO, brought NATO closer to our allies in the Indo-Pacific. And, you know, I think the fact that there are these revitalized groupings like AUKUS, like the Quad, it really sends a signal to countries that, whether they belong to these specific institutions or not, that the United States was ready, willing, and able to mobilize our closest partners to confront collectively the most pressing challenges we faced.
Very good. Thank you, Ned. Larry Nix. Unmute your button.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
We've got you, yes.
Sounds great. Go ahead, Larry.
Mr. Price, I want to look at your comments with regard to different policies towards countries that have democratic systems versus authoritarian systems. And I understand generally the need for a distinction to be made. But I want to bring up two specific countries during the Biden administration that I have some questions about the approach towards very authoritarian governments. The first is North Korea. Now, I remember during the 2020 presidential campaign, candidate Biden voiced very strong criticisms of President Trump's overtures towards Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Mm-hmm. And in those criticisms of President Trump, President Biden and two or three of his top officials, aides, voiced some very biting criticisms of Kim Jong-un, which he began to reciprocate in his own statements about candidate and later President Biden. During the years of the Biden administration, I didn't see any concerted diplomatic policy towards North Korea, even a small semblance of what President Trump had tried to do with negotiations on the nuclear issue. Mm-hmm. And given the lack of what I believe was any sort of U.S. policy, mm-hmm. and this is not the only reason, believe me, we saw North Korea clearly move toward Russia. And that has culminated now in North Korea delivering probably at this point 12 to 14 million artillery shells to the Russians, mm-hmm. which the Russians have been using fruit against the Ukrainian army, mm-hmm. and committing 20,000 North Korean troops to Russia, which has played a major role in pushing the Ukrainians pretty much out of the Kursk region, mm-hmm. which the Ukrainian army entered into a year ago. The North Koreans have taken heavy casualties, but they've also been effective in pushing the Ukrainians back. So I wonder whether the Biden administration, officials of that administration, have at this point any second thoughts about the kind of paralyzing non-policy towards North Korea that the administration seemed to follow. Now, the second country, which I think runs a little bit parallel in the Biden administration's approach towards, is Saudi Arabia. Now, I understand a couple of the big reasons for that. The murder of the Saudi U.S. journalist in Istanbul, with implications that high officials of the Saudi government might have been involved. But it seems to me in hindsight now, could the Biden administration made a greater effort to bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords with Israel during the 4 years of the Biden administration? And if that had happened, could that have served perhaps as a greater deterrence against Hamas in terms of what Hamas did on October the 7th, 2023, and what has happened since? The terrible situation we find ourselves in the Middle East today. Could the Biden administration perhaps made more of an effort to get the Saudis into the Abraham Accords during the term that President Biden was president?
Thank you, Larry.
Yeah. Thanks for both questions. Let me again start with the second question. It was absolutely a goal of the Biden administration to expand the Abraham Accords and to bring in as many of Israel's neighbors, along with others from the Arab and broader Muslim world. It, of course, is good for Israel. It was good for those countries in question. It was good for the stability and security. Our efforts. The fact is, we didn't speak about it much. We didn't speak about it publicly because these were issues that we were trying to work out in the first instance quietly between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Of course, there was a bilateral element between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And by September of 2023, we were most of the way there with a blueprint of what the United States was prepared to do with and for the Saudis, what the Saudis were prepared to do with and for Israel, and what Israel was prepared to do with and for the Saudis, and importantly for the Palestinians as part of this arrangement. And then, of course, came October 7th. And one can look at many catalysts that culminated in October 7th. I think it is undeniable, and I think some of Hamas's own words and literature have pointed to this, that Hamas timed this, at least in part, explicitly to interfere with what we saw as the progress we were making between Saudi Arabia and Israel to set back that progress and to see to it that Saudi Arabia would not normalize relations with Israel. Because just as you said, Hamas, I am certain, recognized the strategic significance of that possibility. And I think they recognized that it would have set back their extremist cause, their extreme cause, perhaps irreversibly. And even after October 7th, there were conversations with the Saudis, with the Israelis. But the fact was, as you might expect, that Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince was not ready to move in the direction of recognizing Israel as long as the war in Gaza raged. We looked at ways that we could help bring about an enduring ceasefire in Gaza, also using Saudi Arabia to help in that, to sort of bring together several of these disparate elements. But ultimately, for reasons that we can discuss in much more depth, this didn't come about, and it's really unfortunate. It's unfortunate that Hamas chose to perpetrate these horrific attacks across Israel on October 7th. First and foremost, the lives that were lost, the lives that were scarred, the hostages who remain in Gaza, but also for what has befallen the Palestinian people, and for the opportunity that may have been, if not permanently, at least squandered for some time between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And I think that was very intentional on Hamas's part. When it comes to the DPRK, look, I think a couple things there. We were very cognizant of the track record that we inherited from the Trump administration. I think it's fair to say that there were really two caricatures. It's unfair to call them caricatures because both were actually playing out before our eyes during the first Trump administration. The first caricature was what we might call the fire and fury caricature. President Trump bragging about his nuclear button, at least implicitly threatening nuclear annihilation against the DPRK in the first couple of years of his first term. The second caricature started to emerge in 2018 or so when President Trump made clear that he wanted to engage in summitry with Kim Jong-un. I think the impression that many of us were left with was that this was entirely empty summitry. There was no substance to it. It was just the definition of a photo op, and efforts to achieve what they referred to as CVID, complete verifiable irreversible denuclearization. It was never anything more than rhetoric. And so we were very cognizant early on that we needed to find a different path. What we said, and we actually undertook a DPRK policy review in the first months of the Biden administration, we wanted to take on, a practical, a calibrated approach, seeking to make tangible progress in a way that increased security for the American people, our deployed forces in the region, Americans back home, but also for our allies in the region, first and foremost, for the ROK. And we sought to do that through a number of ways. First, of course, was dialogue and diplomacy. And we made clear, both before we completed this policy review, but certainly in the aftermath of it, that we stood ready to engage the DPRK without preconditions. We sought to engage in dialogue. We emphasized that we harbored no hostile intent towards the DPRK. Again, we offered to meet, to speak, anytime, any place. And the number of messages we sent through various channels to the DPRK with that message, I think we would lose count. But the response we got was never substantive. And so really the onus, I think, has to be put on the DPRK when you look at the lack of progress that we achieved on the key question of the DPRK's WMD arsenal, but also in terms of other areas. I think our tally sheet is not completely empty, however, and I think so much of what we accomplish can be seen in the enhanced relationship we have with our allies who are most affected and implicated by this. Of course, the ROK first and foremost, Japan as well, other allies in the Indo-Pacific. The way in which we coordinated our strategy and presented the united front to the DPRK with a real inability on the part of Kim Jong-un or his lieutenants to create daylight, to create wedges, to drive wedges, to find wedges between the United States and our allies and partners, that was important. And I certainly hope that the Trump administration, whether they intend to engage in direct diplomacy and dialogue or summitry again, don't make one of the mistakes they made the first time around. And they sort of went it alone. And President Trump himself was the face of this, and our allies were left asking for readouts well after the fact. And so I think that was important, that we made clear that we were going to do this with allies and partners, and we strengthened those relationships. Look, I think the DPRK, including with the recent statement from Kim Yo-jong, has indicated that they would like to engage in diplomacy with the Trump administration. But I think it was notable that they said the prerequisite they offered was the United States recognition of the DPRK's irreversible, and they use that word, as I recall, status as a nuclear weapon state. And so they've gone from floating the prospect of complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization in 2018, 2019, to 2025, when they're talking about their irreversible status as a nuclear weapon state. Whether President Trump and his team will want to engage on that basis is hard to say. I tend to think that this is a president and administration that puts optics ahead of substance, and perhaps they will find it suitable to engage on that basis. If and when they do, I think and hope they will be in a position to take advantage of the tally sheet that the Biden administration leaves behind. And that is, I think, first and foremost, a set of allies who are stronger, who are more concerted, who are more purposeful, who are more united with Washington and between and among each other to go to the table with the DPRK in a coordinated fashion.
Very good. Thank you. Larry, do you have follow-up questions?
Not at this time, Sungju. No.
Okay, very good. Sung-jae Park from Seoul.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure North Korea couple area they wanna talk with the U.S. One of the area is North Korea wanna talk with the U.S. Counterfeit money. If U.S. right now, President Trump's administration tried to communicate with North Korea, and North Korea usually denied to talk with the U.S. But North Korea is open to the counterfeit money area to talk with the U.S. In this case, do you think, U.S. allowed to North Korea like even $1 counterfeit money can make, or what's your opinion?
Yeah, it's a good question, and obviously it's a hypothetical, or at least I think it's a hypothetical, because I'm not aware that this dialogue has gone anywhere just yet. But North Korea's illicit activity, including its cyber activity, its illicit cyber activity, and its money laundering, its counterfeiting, its use of electronic currencies. All of these have posed a core challenge to the international security architecture. In the case of counterfeit money, in the case of its ransomware attacks, in the case of its abuse of sort of cryptocurrency systems, in some cases, these actions have facilitated other activities that pose a threat to the international security architecture. So it's really a compounding threat. And look, I hope the Trump administration takes advantage of the opportunity for dialogue with the North. I think we would all hope that dialogue could be comprehensive, that it could cover the waterfront to include the DPRK's WMD arsenal. But even if there is an opportunity to have a more limited discussion, perhaps that is a place they might want to start. And obviously, counterfeiting is something that they are incentivized to go after. What the arrangement might look like, and what sort of leniency the Trump administration might have towards the DPRK in such an arrangement, it is hard to say. I wouldn't want to venture a guess. I think one of the few things that does give me some degree of reassurance, at least when it comes to the second Trump administration and the DPRK, is the fact that Allison Hooker, whom some of you may know, is in essentially the number 3 position at the Department of State. Allison Hooker was a colleague of many of ours at the National Security Council under President Obama in 2014, 15, 16, and she served in the first Trump administration. She stayed on, was one of the rare people to stay on into the Trump administration, and it seems really acquitted herself quite well with this crowd, and is now in an influential position at the Department of State. She is someone who I think has a good principled understanding of the threat that the DPRK poses, some of the ways in which the United States and our allies and partners might go about mitigating that threat, whether it's in the form of counterfeit currency or money laundering, or other illicit activity, or the WMD arsenal. But having her at that position of state, I think, is a good thing when it comes to our approach to the DPRK. I suppose the caveat to all of this is that we have an administration that tends not to rely on the departments and agencies, whether it's the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence community, but has sort of a very centralized process that really revolves around the Oval Office more so than other administrations. So her influence is there, whether it's felt and whether it is manifest in the decisions, we'll have to see.
Very good. Thank you. Seung-jae, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, one of the issues is recently, Ukraine delegation came to Korea. They mentioned about the possibility Iran's, drone technology go to the Russia, but Russia gave it to the drones, the blueprint to the North Korea. So, and the Ukraine delegation emphasized that, Russia tried to make a drone factory in North Korea. And also they asked us whether Ukraine can work with Korea, this another kind of counter drone, industry working with Ukraine. So I'd like to hear from your opinion.
Yeah, I think just as there has been, and Larry references as well, closer alignment between the DPRK, Russia, Iran, and in some ways the PRC on as sort of their own axis, I think there has to be better, broader, more effective coordination between and among our partners. And in some cases, the United States cannot or need not be sort of the fulcrum. And if close allies of ours or partners of ours, like Ukraine and the ROK, are in a position to coordinate together and to work on a joint challenge like counter UAS technology, counter drone technology, that's a good thing. Not only can there be coordination on this technology, I think there has to be coordination on this technology, and it needs to come from these countries who have seen it up close. Countries that have know the power, know the potential of this technology, and who have the incentive and the wherewithal to come up with technologies to help thwart it, or in some cases to develop better technologies of our own.
Very good. Thank you. MJ.
My name is Marian. I'm an independent researcher based in Seoul. So, Mr. Price, you mentioned earlier how the Biden administration was careful to avoid what you call anti-symmetry and really prioritize working with allies, especially with South Korea and Japan, as a coordinated front when dealing with North Korea. Mm-hmm. As we now look ahead to the upcoming US-Korea summit on August 25th, I'm curious how you view the stake this time around, like given that Pyongyang is now openly demanding U.S. recognition of its irreversible nuclear status. Do you see a risk that this Trump administration might fall back into some of the same patterns, like prioritizing personal diplomacy or sidelining Seoul in favor of one-on-one engagement with Kim Jong-un? And more broadly, how do you think this first summit between President Trump and President Lee Jae-myung could shape the future of the alliances, especially in the region where authoritarian coordination between North Korea and Russia seems to be deepening? Thank you.
Thank you. Both very good questions. Look, I think it's undeniably a very good thing that there is going to be a leader level meeting between the leaders of the United States and the ROK. Obviously, this is an alliance that has spanned decades, but I think it is important now with a new president in Washington and given recent events in the ROK over the past year or so, or 6 months, that these two leaders come together, demonstrate their solidarity, and demonstrate that the interests and values that have been at the heart of the U.S.-ROK relationship remain as such. I think it's, of course, good for the bilateral relationship. I think it is good maintenance for the trilateral relationship as well. And I think to part of your question, it sends a very healthy signal, I think, to Pyongyang and to Beijing as well, that the United States and the ROK, despite political developments in both of our capitals over the course of the past 6 months, we're still standing strong, standing together, and standing in favor of our common values and common interests. When it comes to the Trump administration and the DPRK, I am concerned that they will fall back into the pattern that President Trump left behind when he left office in 2020, early 2021. I think it is in his nature to prioritize optics and imagery over substance and substantive results. I think the variable in this case is that, and you referenced it, but the statement from Kim Yo-jong that the DPRK no longer sees denuclearization or their WMD program as an appropriate basis for talks. That changes things. And I think it will be a very difficult question for the president to consider whether to engage on that basis if the DPRK doesn't shift, doesn't relax, whether President Trump would still go forward with a meeting with Kim Jong-un. I think it would be hard to do in some ways, because when they left off in 2019, before COVID, before everything else that has racked our countries in the intervening years, the conversation was about nuclear weapons. It was about ballistic missiles. It was about, in some ways, the WMD program, in meaningful ways, the WMD program. President Trump, I think, would have a very difficult time messaging how he went from that conversation to a conversation about other issues that did not include issues of WMD. I think there's another pitfall that we saw in the statement from the DPRK. The DPRK made clear that there's friendly relations between Kim Jong-un and President Trump, but the statement went on to say that the DPRK doesn't support dialogue with the ROK. And so I think it's quite clear that the DPRK would love nothing more than to engage the United States on issues that have little or nothing to do with its WMD program, and to do so at the exclusion of the ROK. I hope the wiser minds in this administration would see through that. To my mind, this is a ploy by the DPRK to drive a wedge between the United States and the ROK. I hope the Trump administration doesn't fall for it. Because if they do, I think they will undo so much of that coordination, so much of that alliance development that was advanced during the Biden administration. It will also lead to manifestly worse outcomes when it comes to what the United States is able to achieve with, if anything, with the DPRK. The United States can continue to be a superpower, but there is nothing we can do more effectively alone than what we can do with our allies and partners. In this case, first and foremost, with the ROK, with Japan, with others in the region and well beyond. And the leverage we bring to the table with those countries behind us, with those countries at our back, I think would be all the more important if this diplomacy were to resume on a real and substantive basis.
Very good. Thank you. MJ, do you have follow-up question? MJ?
No, really. Thank you.
Okay. Now, Choo-Hun Kim, go ahead.
So I'm a reporter at NK News. It's a media outlet, and I had a question about South Korea's role in the Indo-Pacific. So to me, it seems like U.S. is more focused on defending Taiwan from China than defending South Korea from DPRK, and especially considering its push for South Korea to pay more for defense. So do you think U.S. troops in Korea could be moved to Taiwan sometime in the future? And in that case, what role do you see South Korea playing in the Indo-Pacific? Do you think South Korea would continue protecting its own territory from the north, or supporting the U.S. in protecting Taiwan from China?
It's a question that I can only speak to from my personal perspective. What I believe as someone who served in previous administrations, not in this administration, I can offer a bit about what I think I've observed from this administration. But look, the way we looked at it during the Obama administration, in the Biden administration, and I think most people who share my mindset in the United States think of it today as all of our alliances are sacrosanct. And we have an alliance with the ROK that has been forged in blood, that goes back decades, that is a ratified security arrangement between our two countries. The basis of our alliances is that they're only as good as the credibility we attach to them. And the United States attaches all the credibility in the world to the alliances that we have forged, whether they're in the Indo-Pacific or across the Atlantic. And so I think it is absolutely the case, speaking as someone speaking as our policy from previous administrations, that the United States, if the DPRK undertook aggressive acts, would stand resolutely with our allies in the ROK. And I think the forces that we've stationed on the peninsula in the region are, a testament to that. Every time our military commanders speak about their readiness when it comes to potential aggression from the DPRK, they speak about their readiness and ability to what they call fight tonight. And I think that is just the key point, that the United States stands by these security commitments. Now, Taiwan, we have an close unofficial relationship with Taiwan. All relationships are different, and the alliance we have with the ROK, of course, is different from the unofficial relationship we have with Taiwan. That is not to say that the United States isn't resolute in believing that there must not be unilateral changes to the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. We absolutely do. But I just don't want to overgeneralize and say that aggression from the DPRK would have the same or a different response to PRC aggression against Taiwan. I think what is important across all of these relationships is that we send a very clear, resolute, unmistakable signal to any revisionists that would seek to change borders by force, that would seek to use force unilaterally, that those countries around the world, the United States included, that have sought to uphold the rules-based order, to uphold the rules of the road over the course of decades, that we would not sit idly by and watch. As I spoke to a moment ago, we did that very clearly in Ukraine. We are prepared to do that very clearly when it comes to our treaty alliances, including with the ROK. And we are prepared to do what is appropriate should there be an attempt to change the unilateral status quo, to change the status quo unilaterally across the Taiwan Strait.
Very good. Any follow-up question, Zhihan?
No, not at this time. Thank you.
Very good. Hije Chung, go ahead, Hije.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, and thank you, Mr. Price, for your remarkable presentation. My name is Hije Chung. I'm a senior at Azusa Pacific University, majoring in international relations and honors humanities. I have two questions for you. First, during your presentation, you mentioned that the Biden administration has worked to promote collaboration with private sectors, such as civil society. Could you provide an example of this cooperation? And second, as a young man aspiring to work for the South Korean government in the future, I'd like to hear more about your role and experience as senior advisor to Secretary of State Blinken. Specifically, what kind of work have you been involved in? Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for both questions. Both are great. I appreciate that. Look, I am someone who spent the vast majority of my professional career inside government. I think there is nothing more rewarding, nothing more interesting, nothing more challenging than public service, and especially when it comes to foreign policy and national security. So I'm really heartened to hear that you are looking at a career as such. I started working for Secretary Blinken in his office after serving as the department spokesperson at the Department of State. He and I had worked closely together, of course, during our time at the State Department, but also during the Obama administration and during our time together outside of government during the first Trump administration. So we really had a relationship predicated on many years. And he asked me to help with some strategic projects we were working on at the time, including when it came to the Global South and the set of and basically the approach that we could take to improve our relationship with our important partners in the Global South on key issues like fentanyl and synthetic opioids, food security, helping him think about our strategic messaging, serving as sort of a day-to-day advisor for him and with him, all of which was just so incredibly rewarding. I think, I often say when I speak to people who are interested in serving in government, yes, the role you're in is important, but in many ways, what's more important are the people for whom you're working. And it's important to have someone you can look up to, someone who can mentor you, someone who represents the highest ideals and the highest principles. And I know that was the case when it came to my work with Secretary Blinken. On your first question, when it comes to civil society and in the private sector, this is something that we work very hard to incorporate into our work, recognizing that so many of the challenges aren't able to be addressed by nation states alone. The Biden administration actually opened an office in the State Department to engage the private sector and to work with them to help galvanize their action on key causes in the aftermath to natural disasters, for example, how they might be able to work by supporting refugees arriving in the United States or arriving elsewhere, how they could work with us on questions like food security and technological advances needed to provide more resilient sources of food around the world. When it comes to civil society, that is also something, an element that we sought to integrate. I'll give you one example. This was actually launched during the Obama administration, but we launched young leaders programs throughout the world. The YALI, the Young African Leaders Program, YSEALI, Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative. A number of these programs in key regions around the world. And the point was to recognize that, yes, our standard interlocutors are going to be other ministers, government counterparts, but we needed to do what we could to help cultivate and to help countries around the world cultivate new generations of leaders who were connected with one another, leaders who had exposure to the type of partnership that the United States sought to provide. And this is a program that continued under the first Trump term. It continued certainly under the Biden administration. We met with many of these young leaders whenever we would travel around the world into the regions where these programs were active. And my concern, as I stated before, is that under this administration, they've been much more ruthless when it comes to resources, so-called soft power resources, and this is certainly one of them. Just because it's soft power doesn't mean that it's not important, that it's not strategic for the United States. And I certainly hope that we can continue some of these programs, given their indispensability to not only countries and regions in question, but to the United States' ability to be an effective leader around the world.
Very good. Okay, Seung-jae, you're the last call.
Well, thank you very much. And, actually, so how you can see the North Korea and Chinese relationship and what will be best way we can approach it with, China and North Korea.
Yeah. Look, it's a very good question. And, I think one of the one of the elements of our approach to the DPRK we thought long and hard about was how we could incentivize the PRC to be a responsible actor. And, you know, I think over the course of a decade, the PRC has gone from what we might call a broadly responsible actor on these questions, allowing sanctions regimes, for example, to be adopted by the UN Security Council, to one that is very clearly a partisan, to one that is very clearly throwing its weight behind the DPRK. It's very disheartening when it comes to the bilateral relationship with the PRC. It's no longer one of those areas where that seems ripe for collaboration and cooperation with the PRC, but even more so, it's profoundly dangerous for the security environment in Northeast Asia. What we conveyed to the PRC on multiple occasions as we saw this concerning pattern emerge of the PRC siding more and more with the DPRK was that, look, it's ultimately within your interest to keep the DPRK in check and to discourage them from taking destabilizing actions, whether it is missile launches or, you know, God forbid, a seventh nuclear test. And we said to the PRC, look, you know, were the DPRK to go ahead with some of these things, ICBM launches, nuclear tests, etc., it would force us to take certain defensive measures in the neighborhood that you would not like. And so ultimately, it's within your interest, and it's in your interest to lean on the DPRK not to do certain things, because we didn't want to have to take these steps to defend ourselves and to defend our treaty allies, but we were determined to do so if the DPRK's own actions required it. So we tried to appeal to PRC self-interest. I think the results on that are mixed. I think it is very clear, as we've talked about, that there is a burgeoning partnership, clearly not an alliance, not a security alliance, but a partnership between the PRC, the DPRK, that also involves Russia and Iran. My fear is that the steps that we initiated and reinforced to try to weaken that burgeoning partnership are being eroded. And I think first and foremost, the alliance maintenance that is required between and among Japan, the ROK, our other allies in the Indo-Pacific, our allies across the Atlantic, that I worry is not being tended to, and the result will be only to reinforce the instincts that have pushed these countries together. I think of when you look at the big developments of the past 5 or so years, the partnership between and among these countries, it has to be among the most worrisome. And I think the development that's been alluded to in this call with the DPRK sending tangible reinforcements in the form of munitions, in the form of personnel to Russia to fight, at least so far, on Russian soil, not in Ukraine as far as we know. But, you know, it's a sign that this partnership is at the very least real, and it's something we all have to continue to be concerned with.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. And Ned, this is a great evening, and we congratulate you. You finally met our people. Some of them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to connect with you all.
Wonderful. We'll get back to you. Let's give Ned
Thanks so much.
big round of applause, okay?
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Good to speak with you.
It's a great, yeah.
Thanks.
The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.